Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Preserving History and Democracy. I'm Cynthia Mendoza, the Communications Coordinator.
And I'm Bernardine Caporale, one of the producers here on the podcast.
I'm really excited about today's topic because it's a little bit different than what we usually do, but we figured it was a very good topic to talk about today. And we have two special guests with us to join us for this episode.
That's right. We have Norma Roberts, who is in the Office of the Probate. And we also have Johnathan Macias, who is the Assistant County Manager right here in Dona County.
That's right. They'll be joining us here shortly. But we wanted to discuss this topic and why we chose it. And I'll be honest with you, Bern, I know nothing about probate, but to me it sounds very complicated. And I'm in the process of purchasing a house, so I figured this is a good topic to talk about.
I agree. It's a topic that is a little bit sad
Yeah.
because no one wants to think about what it will happen when they lose a loved one.
Right.
But it's so important to have these conversations and have everything in order before that time comes.
Absolutely. You know, life happens, and I think you got to be prepared for it. And we also want to let everyone know that we are not offering any legal advice. This podcast episode is simply to educate everybody about what the probate's office does and the importance of it. That's awesome. Johnathan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Wow, where do I start? So I am Johnathan Macias, no relation to the current county manager, Fernando Macias, but I am the assistant county manager here at the county of Dona, and I oversee operations. So a lot of those outward-facing departments like our fire department, fire and rescue, our fleet department, roads and engineering, community development, and many more. And sometimes it feels like, I just wear different hats and have different levels of advocacy. And I'm here today because I have lived experience having gone through probate pretty young in my life. And I remember talking with Judge Baca last year about how it'd be, I think, a good opportunity to share what does probate mean and how can you maybe provide that final act of kindness for your loved ones and spare them from having to go through too much more pain.
Absolutely. With that being said, Norma, can you tell us a little bit about what probate is?
Okay, so probate is the judicial process which someone goes through in order to be appointed as a personal representative in order to settle the deceased affairs that they left behind.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So, Johnathan, you said that you have some experience with probate. Do you want to share a little bit about why this topic is so important to you?
Yeah, but I'm going to give you a trigger warning that what I'm going to talk about comes next involves mental health issues, and it also involves the concept of death, right? Because that's kind of the precursor to probate. And I think as Americans and maybe just in our different cultural societies, sometimes we aren't always comfortable talking about these things. It's like the forbidden discussions. We don't talk about politics. We don't talk about religion. We don't talk about death. But I think there's a place where we can get to where we start making it more destigmatized, because I hope we all realize, or at least acknowledge, that we're all going to die, right, at some point. Not today, hopefully. But I think before we kick it off, let me share with you one of my favorite apps that was shared with me by a friend. That says it's a We Croak app, and it's like this very Bhutanese reminder of our mortality. And so today's quote is, "Now all my teachers are dead except silence," by W.S. Merwin. And that's apropos, because I kind of wondered, I was like, what does that mean in terms of silence? So at any rate, to get to your question, when I was 21, my mother lived with bipolar disorder for most of her life. And it ultimately led to her death. And it was a very difficult situation because it was also around that time that I was coming to terms with who I was, or who I'd always been, and there was some complexities about acceptance within, the relationship that my father and I had, and some, I guess I'm giving you the highlights here, but some of the commitments that my mother had always wanted for me and the family. But essentially what happened is, even though my mother had very specific lived experience, she worked in a law office, I believe she was a paralegal, she died. And I have to give the disclaimer, I am not a attorney, nor do I practice law, but she died intestate, meaning she died without a will. And she passed away in Texas, but my parents maintain properties in Texas and in New Mexico, because we've always been a family that lives here in the borderland. and there were several raw real estate properties that were to be maintained. And to make it even more complicated, which we'll talk about how it's a little bit different in Texas, uh, I have a sister from a different father, and that means a very different approach to how what is known as an estate and how it's divided. So my experience was that we went through all the motions. My mother was. I'll give you some of like the background. So what happened occurred, and then all of the family was in the hospital, and we were gathered around in an intensive care unit. And it was in that moment that my father had made a commitment, even though we had been a little bit estranged because I'll just be very honest. I was coming out at that time, and culturally that means something different in the Mexican society. So my father just felt like, we need to pray about this. We need to do some other things. Maybe you need to see a psychiatrist. And so I encouraged distance at that age because it was more comfortable for me. And maybe that's a conversation for another pod. But anyways, going back to that interaction in the hospital room, everything felt copacetic at that time. My father made commitments about, don't worry, I'll continue to take care of you and your siblings. There is a total of 6 of us, and all of the other children downstream, and I'll make sure that your basic needs are met. At that point, I was still in school, and so school was a very important thing. And then time went on, and that's not what happened. So kind of fast forward, my mother was pronounced clinically brain dead, and we made the decision to take her off of life support. And it was at that moment that we all found out, oh, she doesn't have a will. And so the process, at least in Texas, is that you go through this process without the will, where you have to go to probate, and I'm sure Norma can fill in or Bern, and they declare an administrator. And at that time, my father wanted to be an administrator. And it was very difficult at that age, but because of the narrative that had changed from that day at the hospital to what was being said in terms of, I want to be the administrator, I want to have control of all the assets, and I will do what I see fit, it changed from that narrative of, I will take care of you. It turned more into, I think we've done enough up until this point in terms of what your mother and I did for you and all the kids, so I'll go ahead and administer as I see fit. And so I made the very difficult decision with my sister for us to file suit against the estate and to contest. Yeah, it was hard.
That must be tough.
Yeah, so I'll leave it there, but that's my lived experience, and we can kind of work through that. And it was about a year's ordeal. That's what I mean could have been saved, and we wouldn't have had to have gone through the re-trauma if we had talked about it and acknowledged what does it mean when somebody passes.
Right. And I think that's something like you touched on. People don't want to talk about death and what happens afterwards. I worked in life insurance before this job, and it's the same thing. People don't want to talk about what happens when you pass away, but I think it's important to have these things in order, because if there's one thing that's inevitable, it's death, unfortunately. And especially if you have a family, if you have property, it's important to have these things in order, right? So, Norma, what's the difference between probate at the county clerk's level and the district court level?
Okay, so one thing is, if everyone's in agreement in the family as to who's going to be the representative, and who gets what, in a sense, that would be easily handled by the county probate. Our process is an informal process, which means that we don't supervise the personal representative. Our job, or the judge's job, is to simply appoint the personal representative according to the will, if there is one, or according to the the laws of the state of New Mexico for intestacy, if there's no will. And so the difference, a lot of things can trigger a case starting at the county probate and then having to be transferred to the district court, and then there's things that automatically just sends that directly to district court, and one of those is feuding among family members. As soon as we detect that's going to be a possibility, we just might as well open the case at district court. But The other thing is if they have a will and it's been more than 3 years since the date of death, then that also automatically sends them to district court. And then if they have a copy of a will, in the probate court in the county, we only open probates with original wills. So if all they have is a copy, then they have to go to district court as well. So, and also district court can do informal and formal probates. And we don't have hearings, and they do.
Right.
So those are some of the differences of why there's different courts and who handles what.
Right.
And I have a question now. This came up when you were speaking, Johnathan. Your mom did not have a will, yet probate opens sometimes when there is a will. Can you explain that for us?
So there is a misconception where people believe that if they have a will, they're ready to go. And, I have a will, it appoints me as the personal representative, I'm taking off and doing everything. But in reality, the appointment or nomination in the will is not official until a probate judge appoints that personal representative. So they do have to come through probate first, but you also have to keep in mind that even if there is a will, you may still not even need probate. Because what triggers who needs probate is if there's real estate in the name of the deceased only, if there's bank accounts in their name only, if there's an auto that's still being paid for and there's a loan against and a lien against that auto, then that triggers probate. If there's not, and if someone were to pass away in an auto accident and there's a lawsuit and you need medical records, that's another reason to open probate. But one thing I want to point out is that not everybody who passes away has to have a probate open for them, unless those circumstances and others that I don't, want to get too much into, but that's one difference. And then when the main point of a will is to appoint a personal representative, and of course address the wishes of the deceased. But if there is no will, then the probate judge's duty is to appoint the personal representative,
Right.
according to the laws of priority in New Mexico. And so in either case, whether there's a will or not, probate may or may not be needed.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
Okay.
It does,
sense
and
to me.
it highlights the complexity of the process. And I think I reflect back on how when we're going through all this secondary trauma, we might not even be ready, or
Exactly.
let alone feel, and I think that's one of the reasons it goes on for so long sometimes.
I'm glad you said that, because one of the misconceptions is that someone passes away, and I've literally had people call me the next day, I need to open probate. And I would really like to, inform people that they need to take their time to grieve and, put their family members to rest. There is no rush to get to probate, the next day. In fact, you cannot open probate until 5 days after someone has passed away. But and there's also, if there is a will, there is a restriction of three years from the date of death to open probate. So it doesn't have to be done,
It's not an urgent matter. then.
urgent.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's good to take their time, and then come in when they're emotionally ready to go through the process.
Right.
Hmm.
I think that's a really good point. I think you bring up a point about Norma, about that other things we need to destigmatize, which is allowing ourselves to go through the process of grief, and maybe not coming right away and saying, I need to open probate. Maybe saying, I need to go talk with a grief counselor, whether
Yes.
that's individually or with the family, in a family process, because I know my family went through it, and it uncovered other dynamics that we had not really addressed. And I can't imagine having gone directly into probate, because our emotions would have been so raw, and I
Right.
don't know that we would have been making decisions clearly. In fact, and I hope I don't come across as callous, but one of the things is that I say, oh, I had to sue my father, and that's something I live with. But at that time, it didn't feel like that. It felt like I was honoring the wishes of my mother, and even though I stood to benefit, I was there to advocate for them, even though they were too young to know what I was trying to do or what the intention was, because we're talking siblings that were probably 10 years of age or younger.
Oh, wow.
So they wouldn't come to realize the benefit. And those that were close enough in age, my father had to go to all of them and petition to get their signature, which basically was for them to sign away their claim and allow him to be the executor as the surviving parent. And I don't know many children that age that would be ready, or teenagers, I should say, right?
Right.
So anyways, I just want to put that out there because this is my little hook or push for let's talk to mental health providers first before we start making decisions, because I think that helps us give a level head.
Absolutely. So where does one start the process? Let's say, so me, I'm 30 years old. I'm purchasing a home recently. I have a family. Where would I get started, just in case, if that were something I would be interested in?
Yes. So you could come into the office and speak to the probate judge and go over your situation with the judge, and then it involves opening the probate case first, and so we would need to go on the fact of whether there is a will or no will for the decedent. That would be the starting place, and then once we realize which one is the correct for that situation, then we have a list of documents in our probate packet that outline the forms that need to be completed, and of course you always have to provide an original death certificate and an original will in the county if you have one, and in our office, to open a probate, the cost is $35. People think it's going to be an outrageous amount of money, but it's not. It's only $35 at the county, $132 at the clerk's office just to open the probate case. And then, of course, if attorneys get involved, there's going to be additional fees, but just to give you an idea. But it's all about completing the application packet, turning it in at the county. Like I said, there are no hearings, so it's about the judge reviewing the documentation that's provided, and then we open the probate case, issue letters of administration if there's no will, letters testamentary if there is a will, and then the personal representative can move forward with settling the decedent's affairs.
Okay. Cool.
Well, I was gonna ask you, was that a real example? Like, I just bought a house?
Yeah, we're buying a house next week.
Oh,
so,
congratulations.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. So, I'm one of those people, like, I like to be prepared. My boyfriend gets annoyed with it, but I think it's important to have everything in order because life happens and you gotta be ready. And even though I'm only 30, I think it's important to have your affairs in order. So
I agree. I bought my first house at 30. It was one of my goals, and I was able to do it. But I'm kind of curious. Are you in a place where you'd like to share what you'd want to have happen to that house if you were to depart, or you and your boyfriend were to depart? Because I don't want to get into your business and ask how you're going to deed, how you're going to buy.
I feel you.
But I think this is the thing. Buying a home is one of the single largest purchases.
Exactly.
And again, I don't know how much money you're putting on your down payment, but you're locking in some equity.
Exactly, yeah.
And so, do you want to talk about it? Are you in a place, or do you want to take a pass?
No, that's okay. I mean, me and my boyfriend, we're basically married. At this point, it's just the ring that's missing, but that's another topic. But I mean, what?
Another podcast.
Yeah, another podcast. We'll get into that. But, we're purchasing the home together. We've both put in our life savings into it. So if something were to happen to me, I'd like for him to have it. And, if something were to happen to both of us, I'd like my daughters to have it. So I think it's important to have those discussions because, like I said, I worked in life insurance, and that's something that we talk about as well as having a plan, because nobody expects for tragedy to happen, but unfortunately it does. So
yeah, I agree. And you gave me chills just thinking about that, because and I think it's because you have the maturity of having seen why people get life insurance and knowing that they want to have people taken care of. But I do want to touch upon one other thing which I mentioned. So of course different states have different applicabilities, right? And again, I got to give the disclaimer. So I do have a real estate license in a neighboring state, but I don't practice too often. but I'm not giving legal advice. I'm only sharing my observations of what I've seen in other situations. So we're talking about a real estate transaction here, and in many places, so Texas has. I'll give you the Texas version, and maybe Norma or Bern can fill in what happens in New Mexico. But you, let's say, you were buying that house on your own, and you could choose how you wanted to deed it.
Right.
You might decide, you know what, I put only my life savings, and maybe that's a conversation you and your boyfriend had, and because you wanted your daughters to benefit if anything were to happen, whatever the situation is. So how things are deeded are very important, and there's also these concepts of deeds that are called joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, and in those is where you can name who the house should go to in the event of your premature departure, and it's not an like a for sure thing, and Norma and Vern can tell us not have to go to probate, but that's like one way of, okay, maybe I'm not ready to say who gets my shoe collection, but I'm ready to say who gets my house in the event. And I think that's really important, because even in Texas they have these concepts of ladybird deeds, and those are where maybe somebody is on palliative care. They still are in their a judge is able to declare them that they have the sound mind to be able to make decisions, but they turn over and they say, my surviving person can make the decisions, and then upon my death it will automatically transfer to them as well. The only thing about those is that they get a little bit complicated, and I've seen with some transactions where it's like they pass away, and then what happens often, the surviving spouse dies of heartache, right? And then it's like they have to track, it's called the inheritancy, so you have to find out all their survivors, and then that's when you learn really fun things, which is, oh, I didn't know mom or dad had this other child from somewhere else. And guess what, they have a claim to the estate, and guess what, you get to go and meet a new person that might not be in the same place you are in terms of what their intentions are. Not that anybody's greedy, but once they learn, like, maybe they feel like they are entitled to something because in the absence of their presence. So just things to think about, because I think talking with an attorney is good, because I think it's cheaper to talk with them and get your will in order on the front end. Speak with your clergy or your religious or your spiritual advisors, because sometimes this transcends into other things. And then talk with just talk with people that are all well versed with this, so that they understand what your intentions are. And last but not least, I always put a plug for, and go and talk with a friend that's a doctor or a nurse, because the other thing is, what are your advanced directives, and what do you want to have happen if you are in an emergency situation, and who gets to make that decision for you? Because I think in our society we don't talk enough about, like, do not resuscitate orders, or the level, and it's hard, the level of intervention you want when you're on your deathbed, and what are you okay with? Like, are you okay with a feeding tube? Are you okay with being resuscitated? Or do you want palliative measures, and do you want to just maybe be sent home and pass away in the comfort of your home?
I think these are all important topics, or important discussions to have with your family. Absolutely.
Well, as a person who works for the county clerk, not the county clerk's probate, we see a lot of deeds. And Johnathan, you brought up the joint tenants. And I would like Norma, if you could, address that with us. What does that mean when I see joint tenants on a deed?
Okay. Well, in probate terms, if it means that if there's two people on a deed, it typically automatically goes to the surviving individual. However, in this terms of if it's husband and wife, as long as they're married when they pass away, then the joint tenancy takes effect. If they were to get a divorce, it breaks the joint tenancy. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of the joint tenants. But really, in the probate court and in the county court, we don't get too in-depth into who gets what. Because that is out of our jurisdiction. So when it must be handled by district court in order to determine. But I did want to disclose that about the divorce. It does void the joint tenancy.
Okay.
See, I didn't even know that. See, we learn so many things, and this is why you need to talk with professionals.
So, Johnathan, you said you have experience with real estate. Do you suggest people purchasing a home, or maybe if you've had a home for a while, getting these affairs in order, even if you are, a young age?
Yes, I definitely do. And I will share with you that there's even a process where, oh my gosh, I don't want the legal community to come after me. But I will say that for at least myself, when we were updating
Mhm.
our deed in a nearby state, that we were able to use a template and we were able to update it and make sure it was notarized.
Right.
And then we just came down to the good old county clerk's office, and they were able to record that.
Okay.
And that's, again, it's like you could have an attorney do that, and you could
Mhm.
have them take care of it all the way from inception to filing and just
Right.
make it very turnkey. But I'd encourage people to at least get comfortable with that process, because
Okay.
taking ownership of it now means that it's not going to feel as awkward when you have to
Right.
go back and maybe undo something because you go through a separation or a divorce
Right.
or a death.
Yeah. Okay. I think a lot of people are intimidated by like the concept of a will or all those things because you think, oh, a lawyer needs to be involved, but that's not always the case, right?
Yeah. So for the probate court, wills can be written, handwritten. They can be fill in the blank. They could be typed up and, of
Right.
course, prepared by an attorney. New Mexico law, there's two things that make a will valid, and that would be it must name a personal representative, and we suggest naming at least one alternate.
Okay.
And then the other thing is it must contain two witnesses. And it does not have to be notarized, although a notary does count as a witness.
Right.
And then it does not need to be filed with the county clerks in order for it to be valid.
Well, and I kind of want to share a story. So I have a sister-in-law who I love dearly, and she is now ascended to the rank of an Air Force captain in the United States Air Force.
Wow.
And I remember when they were given the deployment, they I think because they left, I can't remember if they left stateside, and I think they were sent to Okinawa. And I'll never forget, I should say, that she called me and she said, "Hey, I have a packet going to you, but first I got to have this discussion." And so apparently it's very common in the military for them to prompt this conversation, and they ask them, "What do you want to do with your affairs?" And more importantly for them at that point, I think at that time they had 2 kids. They now have 3 lovely daughters, and they're my nieces. And so it was a phone call, but she gave me the heads up and she said, "We've your brother and I have made the decision that in the event that something happens to us, we'd like you to manage our affairs and to take care of our girls." And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I think this is what happens when you're the
Yeah.
firstborn. Well, I call myself the oldest from the second batch because my sister's older than me. But but I see, that's what I talk about normalizing. Like my eyes get watery as I think about it, because
Yeah.
I've decided I don't want to have kids because I grew up with so many of my siblings and kind
Yeah.
of a secondary parent.
Right.
So the weight of thinking, oh my gosh, what would I have to move? Would I move to them? Could I find a job there? Do I move
Yeah.
them here? What do you do for children that are disruptive? How are my brother and my sister-in-law going to leave this earth? And I
Yeah.
hope, like all these things run through your mind. And then so the thing I just remember saying is, thank you for telling me. Yes, I will do this for you. It would be my honor. Hopefully we never have to do this, but if we do, at least you've got a plan, and just know that they will be taken care of. And then about a day or two later, the express envelope showed up on my doorstep, and I put it in my safe in my house, and
Nice.
I have a copy, so now I know. And I didn't read through it because I'm not nosy, I'm not ready to
Yeah.
know. But those are the kinds of conversations that I think are beautiful conversations to have now, because otherwise, gosh, people pass away, and you find out of a surprise, and then when would you get to be able to say, like, thank you for entrusting me with this? Or on the inverse, if you're not at that point in your life, maybe
Right.
you could say, oh, I'm okay with this but not okay with that.
Right.
Or no thank you, maybe I'm working through some things right now. Is there a different scenario that we can come up with?
I think it's amazing that we come together today to talk about this stuff. I think it's very important. I lost my godfather about a week and a half ago.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
And
sorry
I
for
was
your
in
loss.
very, very close with him by text and email
Yeah.
and phone conversations. And he just stopped responding. And I said, maybe he went on vacation. No, he would have told me. He would have told me he was going on vacation.
Mhm.
And then the feelings come in. Something happened. And sure enough, he passed very suddenly. And I hope that he had his things in order.
Yeah.
He was the kind of guy who would have. But I hope for his wife and his family that he had his things in order. It's really enough to grieve
Yeah.
without having to deal with the realities of what they left.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I agree.
yeah. So thank you for having this conversation.
Yeah,
today.
thank you guys. I know
Yeah.
it's tough.
Well, and it's very difficult, and I kind of want to share kind of a final example. It sounds like we're coming to a natural close here, but kind of want to talk about the power of what having these conversations on the front end can be.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this morning or last night as I was thinking, what do I want to share? And in the minority community, and remember, minority can mean many different things, right? It can mean minority based on socioeconomic status. It can mean minority based on your race and ethnicity.
Right.
But I think one of the things that we've seen in the mainstream is that those that are on the higher end of the socioeconomic status or the SES, these things are just inherent. Like these folk, and I say they because I'm thinking millionaires and billionaires, they have a plan. They have it ready. Like they
Yeah.
know how to do their taxes. They have an army of people that help them with these things, but they also help them with estate planning.
Right.
And one of the things that comes into that is this concept of generational wealth. And so for those of you that are thinking about, I don't have anything, right? Because I've heard this, and then people say, all I've got is a car and all I've got is this house. That is wealth. And in this day and age, if you're able to, we'll take your example, if you're able to convey the property to your daughters in a way that doesn't tax them in a monetary way, they are going to be able to be so much ahead
Right.
of many other people, and maybe not get into a situation where things are going to have to be administered by the state, and then like time and all these things go on. But that is a way for us, the people that are not millionaires, to start thinking about generational wealth building. Because just think about it. If you didn't have to pay for your biggest living expense, or it was very, very small,
Right.
Because you went and you got a good life insurance policy that allows you to then pay those things off and it names
Yeah.
the beneficiaries, that is wealth building. And I'll give you just a very like napkin math concept because I really want to destigmatize these conversations. So when my mother passed away, this was in 2005, I think we finally settled the estate about a year later. We found a great attorney that was willing to work based on whatever the settlement would be, a percentage of that. Or I think he did a flat fee after he came to know us because it wasn't too complex. So we owed him something after we were able to recoup. And again, in Texas, it is such that while most things are community property, if there is a child from a previous marriage,
Right.
it gets divided in half for the surviving spouse, and then the other half gets divided among all the children just automatically. And so we had to go through the lovely process, and I say we, but really my father had to go through the process of getting an appraisal for all the raw land that he had, and the community assets, including a home that we had in Sunland Park, because that's where I grew up. And then we moved to El Paso, so then the home that was in El Paso. So then obviously the land in New Mexico, well, that community property, that just automatically went over. But as a result of that, I was what's the proper word? I guess calculated to receive $20,000 as part of the estate. And as a 21-year-old, oh my gosh, that's a lot, right? And I could have gone and bought a lot of fun stuff. I can only imagine the things that we can buy nowadays. And in any event, but then I had owed my father $5,000 for something where he helped me with a business investment. So he said, well, you take an IOU for the remaining 5. And I was like, okay, 15, sure, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So I paid off some debt with the $5,000. I was still in school, so I was living off of some of my student loans. And I just thought, what could I do with this money? And I tried to be as responsible as I could at the really smart age of 21. We're so smart at that time. And the only thing I could think of was I hadn't really played with the stock market.
Okay.
And I had studied it up until that point, and one of the things that people always say is, I got to give all these disclaimers. I am not a financial advisor, but they always say if you're going to invest in things that you frequent and things that you buy, because you'll naturally keep track and So
Right.
I invested in Apple computer stock. I invested in some publicly traded companies in the region, and I kind of squirreled away and hid the money for myself, so that maybe $8,000 or $10,000 went in 2006. I have to go back and look at the date, and then I did this really cool thing that's called a dividend reinvestment plan, a DRIP, which means that I never wanted to get a payout if the companies did any kind of payback or to the stock. It just automatically goes and buys fractional pieces of the stock. So it was like my way of making a nest egg, and in this very poetic way, I felt like this $10,000, $8,000 was a manifestation of my mother's love and caring for me, because my mother was always the kind of person that would say, do you have enough? Do you have what you need? When I got my first apartment, she'd come and she'd open my cupboard. She's like, this isn't going to do. You don't have staples. I don't see bread in here. I don't see sugar, oil. She's like, I'm going to go to the grocery store. I was like, okay. And then she'd always have this really funny interaction with my father. She'd, back when checks were a thing, and for those of you who don't know what checks are, it's when you write down, and then you could even write it out to CASH, which is cash, and you could go get some money out of that, or they'd write it to my name, and it was my pocket money, like we're talking like $100, and so that was the spirit of my mother, and she always did that, and my father would always be like, "Why are you writing checks? You didn't even tell me about it," and she's like, "Don't worry about it. You can't take it with you when you die." So I'm just like, oh my gosh. So anyway, so fast forward, I make these investments and I just didn't think about it. And what was really poetic about that is that when it came time for me to buy my first house, the investments had matured so much that it took care of a significant amount of my down payment.
Wow.
It also
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, thanks, Mom. Yeah, and she always wanted that. She was always very big about, like, you should buy property, you should do this. And as a teenager and as a young person, you're like, whatever, I'm going to go live my best life. And even when I bought my car, and I just kept practicing this, like, I'm not a very spendy person. I like nice things, but I try to work for them. And even when I bought my car, I dipped into some of my stocks, and I use that. So it's so funny because I think about it as like this well, and every time I see my portfolio, which was largely fueled by that estate, I guess payout, it's a nice remembrance of my mother, and though she's not here physically, she's still taking care of me in a different way.
I love that. That's awesome. So I want to again emphasize that we're not giving any legal advice on any of the stuff that we talked about today, just so everyone knows.
Yeah, just sharing our lived experience.
Exactly. That being said, is there anywhere you guys suggest people get started if they're interested in doing a will, or if they need to open probate, or any of these kinds of things that we discussed today?
So the New Mexico Legal Aid does monthly workshops locally, and they have a phone number that you can call and check to see when those are. And I really like referring people to them to go through the estate planning workshop and get their affairs in order, just because, again, we are limited to what we can do, again, because we are also not attorneys. But I do want to emphasize that going through the probate process is not as tedious as people seem to think it is. It is not. It does not take as much time as they think it is. In our case, we appoint the personal representative. We go through the necessary steps and paperwork to do that. And then once a personal representative is appointed, it's up to them to take care of everything that pertains to the estate at their own pace, and so it's up to, they're in control how long everything's going to be in probate.
Okay. Johnathan, any resources you can think of for people who are interested in all this?
I have two. Ask, be curious. If you know somebody that's gone through this process, ask them. It's a good place to start, and especially if they are the surviving spouse, or they've been the beneficiary, or if they've had to be the administrator, ask them about that, and ask them what could have been easier if you guys had talked about this on the front end. And then the second one is the Community Foundation of Southern New Mexico does it at least yearly. They do an estate planning. And if you reach out and ask Dr. Tara Winter, I think they are at 575-521-4794. You can ask them when the next one is. I believe it's typically free. And I will say the positive thing about this, because my poor father's taking a lot of beatings today, but we now have a really good relationship.
Oh, wonderful.
But would you believe that I still don't know what he wants in terms of his estate and his last wishes? And this came up in a very public setting a couple years ago, where one of my siblings asked, well, who's going to be your executor? And because now we talk about it like that. Yeah. And it's a bit of a running joke. Whenever we do something with our father and we try to cajole him into paying for it, we say, it's okay, just take it out of the inheritance. But that's us normalizing it, right? And that also gives you a clue as to how we're on the other side of this now that we've experienced all that pain. Right. But we jokingly say that, but the reality is, so they said, or my father said, oh, well, John's my executor. And I'm just like there midway, and I'm like, wait, what?
Come again?
And I'm like, oh, okay. And then, of course, it creates questions about, well, why is he the one that's the most apt to do that? And I told my dad, I said, wow, I wish we could have talked about this before you dropped this here in this random, otherwise lovely family meeting or lunch or whatever. And I just told him in this kind of reminder, I said, I hope you have it all figured out by now, because I don't want to go through that again. Like, that was really painful. And now my bigger concern is I don't care about your estate. I care about your advanced wishes. And you haven't talked to me about that. And guess what? You've got 3 or 4 healthcare providers in the family that are your children. And we could walk you through those discussions because it's hard to have those discussions in the heat of the moment. But anyways, I bring this up because when I saw that estate planning with the foundation, I suggested to my father, I said, hey, if you still haven't figured it out, why don't you come spend a day or two? And I think it's about a day and a half immersive discussion with legal people and realtors that can help walk through all the options. And then they give them kind of like the DIY and the other resources if they want somebody to help plan a more intricate or advanced mechanism, like a living trust or a trust of some sort that can also be used in these processes.
Perfect. And we can link those to our this episode just so people can get to those. We want to thank you guys again for coming and sharing your story. I know those are tough. So
It is tough, but this is also cathartic, and I do want to say my condolences to you, Bern.
Oh, thank you so much.
That's hard. It's hard.
And thank you, Norma, for giving your expertise for us
Thank
as
you.
well.
Yes,
So,
I enjoyed it.
where can people reach the probate clerk's office?
We are here Monday through Thursday.
Okay.
We are closed on Fridays. We are open from 8 to 5, whether it's myself and the judge or just me or just the judge. Either way, one of us will be there.
Right.
And we're located inside the county clerk's office at the probate counter in the government center. And we work by walk-in basis. You do not have to have an appointment to come see us. And we do recommend coming in, and we are more than happy to provide any guidance and make this process as easy as we can through the difficult situation that a death in the family can be.
Right. Well, thank you guys again. That does it for this episode of Preserving History and Democracy. We want to thank our guests, Norma Roberts and Johnathan Macias. This episode is hosted by myself, Communications Coordinator Cynthia Mendoza, our producer Bernardine Caporale, and Jacob Slaughter, who's behind the camera. Thanks again for joining us. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at daclerk@donianacounty.org. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.